Yes, we're still on Roman numeral 3. We're going to finish this today, the existence of God. And we've looked at several lines of evidence regarding His existence, and you'll notice, of course, on your outline there, we talked about matter demands a maker, the law of cause and effect, or the cosmological argument. Life demands a life giver, the law of biogenesis. Design demands a designer, the teleological argument. Intelligence demands an intelligent creator. And today we want to look at morality demands a moral law giver. Certainly what a person believes is the main impetus as far as behind or in back of what causes him to act. I mean, how he behaves. And everybody in this world believes some things are right and other things are wrong. I mean, everybody has a system of morality and ethics. Now, they may all be the same, and they differ from culture to culture and individual to individual, but we all have one. The English word morality comes from the Latin word mores, meaning habits or customs. Morality is therefore the habit of following the rules of proper conduct. Ethics comes from a Greek word meaning character. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll see a definition something like the discipline dealing with what is good and bad or right and wrong, a group of moral principles or set of values. And so our ethics then is the system that a person uses to determine, well, what is right, what is wrong. So morals and ethics deal with proper conduct, duty, virtue. How should we behave? How ought we to behave? And if such a thing as good and evil, right and wrong exist, how do we go about determining what particular things are right and wrong? And so you've only got two origins as far as morality and ethics. It's kind of like the question that Jesus asked the chief priest and others on that occasion when he put them on the horns of the dilemma. And he said, from whence come, John's teaching? Was John from, was that from heaven or from men? Well, there were no other options. And that's kind of the way it is with morality and ethics. I mean, are they, did they come from within us? And if they came from within us, that really means they came from, if you're an evolutionist, they came from mud and slime and inorganic matter. That's where morality and ethics arose. Or did it come from some higher being? Did it originate with God? And so it's interesting that you have to believe that matter, inorganic matter, somehow evolves some moral consciousness, which just seems ridiculous on its face. I mean, we're supposed to be the top of the animal kingdom if you're an evolutionist. Which, by the way, people sit around and fret and wring their hands and say, why do kids act the way they do in school, these days? Well, we've only been teaching them for 30, 40, 50 years now that they're animals. Well, how else do you expect them to behave? I mean, does a pig feel remorse when he eats his young? Does a dog feel remorse when he steals a bone from another dog? Did you know that 10% of the diet of Komodo dragons is young Komodo dragons? Does that bother them? Do they wake up and say, man, I wish I hadn't eaten that poor little fella yesterday? No, they don't. And so why? Why do they not have this idea of right and wrong? It's interesting, too, that evolutionists and atheists have even admitted that if society were based on the way their teaching logically goes, that this would be a miserable place to live, frankly. Most of them don't follow the end result of their teaching. In other words, if you believe that life has no purpose, and you believe that we're just evolved from purposeless matter, then there are no such thing as ethics and morals. And some will teach that. You see a few nuts in the news now that are willing to stand up and admit that. You know, the ones that teach that, for instance, you know, what's the big deal about rape? Men are just doing what men have always done. I mean, that's the way the caveman did. Isn't that the way dogs are? I mean, dogs just go out and they find another female in heat and they just attack them, and we don't punish dogs for that. But some of these guys will stand up and say, well, you know, we're just doing what's been, you know, what our genes have been telling us to do for 2 million years. No big deal. And of course, you know, it has effects on society. I mean, why are people willing to accept the idea not only of abortion, you know, murdering unborn children, but now, you know, we're murdering, you know, old people that we've decided don't have any purpose left. And that's allowed now in some states, especially the weird ones out west. But morality. And people are going to use some kind of system. I've got a list there, and I didn't really mean to put that back in there. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on that, but we can quickly look at some systems that people use there that's listed in your outline. Relativism. Well, that's pretty easy to understand. I mean, relativism says there's really no universal rules, right? It varies from culture and environment. One system's as good as the other. It's relative. Hedonism, we know what that is. What's hedonism? Yeah, the highest good is achieving the greatest possible amount of pleasure. And in fact, Aldous Huxley and other famous atheists have admitted, look, the reason they want to believe that there is no God, and the reason they believe in evolution, the reason they're atheists is because then they're allowed to throw off all restraint on their sexual proclivities. I can live any way I want to and behave any way I want to, and it doesn't interfere with my sexual freedom. Utilitarian means something that's useful. This is a little misleading here. This particular ethic says that good is determined by what produces the great amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. Now, hedonism says what's good is what brings me pleasure, personally. That's hedonism. But utilitarianism says, well, what's good is, you determine what's good is what brings the most pleasure to the most people. It's interesting. Catherine Tate was the daughter of renowned British agnostic Bertrand Russell. She wrote a book in which she described what it was like to live and grow up in their household. She had brothers. And so she said her father firmly believed, now he's an agnostic, that parents should teach a child with its very first breath that it has entered into a moral world. Now, this is the interesting part. But as any evolutionist would, her father had great difficulty in defending that position, that you live in a moral world. And so she said in her book that she could remember when she was a child, she would say something like, I don't want to, why should I do that? And he would say, because, you know, you ought to. Well, why do people have a sense of oughtness to begin with, as opposed to animals? I ought to get up in the morning, I ought to go to work, I ought to do what's right. Animals don't think that way. She observed in her book that a normal parent might respond by saying, because I say so, or because your father says so, or because God says so. That's kind of the way the normal parent responds. Of course, he wasn't the normal parent, so he would say something like this to his daughter, because more people will be happy if you do than if you don't. Now that's utilitarianism, right? And she would say, well, so what? I don't care what I don't care what they want. And then he would say, oh, but you should. And she would say, well, why should I care? And then he would say, because more people will be happy if you do than if you don't. And so then finally she says in her book, we felt the heavy pressure of his rectitude and obeyed. She would eventually obey. But the reason was not convincing neither to us or him. And he understood that reasoning wasn't very convincing anyway. What is situationism? Yeah, situation ethics. What does that say? Yeah, right or wrong changes. It ebbs and flows with the circumstances in which I find myself. In other words, today I might be in a circumstance where it's right to tell the truth. Tomorrow I might be in a different circumstance where the right thing to do is, tell a lie. It determines, it just varies on the situation that I'm in. Now, determinism is the actual consistent view that an evolutionist ought to take. If I'm a real evolutionist, then I should believe that I am behaving purely based on what? And Dan Barker took this position in his debate with Kyle Butt, that there's no such thing as freedom of choice. We're not free moral agents, but we behave based upon our what? We make decisions based upon what? Our genetics. Our genes tell us. And so here's the interesting thing. You have to ask yourself a question. He would say that because of your genes, it's already been determined as to whether or not you believe in God or not. You would have to take that position. See, I'm not a free moral agent. I don't get to choose. So the fact that you're all here is because of your genes. The fact that other people are not here is because of their genes. So the question, it begs itself then, why do you write books attempting to persuade me to be an atheist? Why would you do that? Why would you write a book asking me to persuade me that God doesn't exist when my genes tell me that I must believe in God? That's the way I've been programmed. Not very consistent, is it? So, all of this, of course, it reminds me a little bit of Clarence Darrow, who was a scoundrel, by the way. I mean, he's held up as some great lawyer, member of the American Civil Liberties Union. And did you know he was disbarred, I think, in California for bribery, even before the famous... no, not Scopes. Scopes wasn't the trial that made him. It was Leopold and Lowe who murdered that little 14-year-old boy, those two teenagers. One was 18, one was 17. He defended them at trial and got them out of the death penalty. Now, whether or not you think you ought to be executing 18, 17, 18-year-olds, that's a whole other issue. But he managed to get them life plus 99 years or whatever. But his argument in that trial, and by the way, he had a 12-hour closing argument. I'd have been asleep a long time before he finished. But his argument, of course, was that these poor boys did what they did because of their environment, because of, it wasn't their fault, in other words, it was because of other things. Determinism, evolution. They did what they did because that's just who they were. And if you think about it, if you're an evolutionist, I mean, what was one of the basis of Darwin's theory? Why do things evolve? What happens? What happens to things as they go along the way? Some drop out and some survive. Why? One's weak and one's strong. Survival of the fittest. That's the way evolution works. Well, why don't we? I mean, we shoot horses, don't we? That break their legs. Well, shouldn't we just do that to people? Right? Survival of the fittest. And we see that today. We're dispensing with both old and young because they're no longer needed or useful in society. But here's the thing, and here's the bottom line. Evolutionists will admit, and this is why they don't always go to the nth degree with the logic, is because they admit that morals arise only in people and not any other part of God's creation. And there is something that everybody will admit, even atheists will admit, this is wrong under all circumstances. Let me read you some quotes. By the way, Antony Flew and Wallace Matson, those were the two that debated, famous debates with Brother Warren, right? both of them admitted the existence of objective morality, even in their debates. Objective morality, not subjective. There are things that everybody can agree are right or wrong. Atheist Michael Ruse admitted in his book Darwinism Defended that the man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says that 2 + 2 = 5. Well, on what basis does he say that? I agree with him, but what's the foundation of his belief if he's an atheist? Which is not objective. Because he could say, that's wrong, and I could say, well, I don't think it's wrong. I'm a pedophile, and I don't think it's wrong. Philosophers Francis Beckwith and Gregory Kukul said, those who deny obvious moral rules, who say that murder and rape are morally benign, that cruelty is not a vice, and that cowardice is a virtue, do not merely have a different point of view, they have something wrong with them. Well, I agree with that too. But again, upon what basis do you say that? What's the foundation for objective, not subjective, but objective good and evil? How can an atheist say something's atrocious, deplorable, evil, wicked, when you think that moral value came from mud, rocks, and slime? And the fact that humans even contemplate morality points out the huge difference between us and the animal world. George Gaylord Simpson, you've probably heard, one of the most recognized atheistic evolutionists of the 20th century, confessed that, quote, good and evil, right and wrong, concepts irrelevant in nature except from the human viewpoint, become real and pressing features of the whole cosmos as viewed morally because morals arise only in man. Why is that? Well, that's what we're talking about, the moral argument. If morals arise only in man, they didn't come from inorganic matter and they didn't come from animals. It's based on what? Obviously, it's based on the unchanging nature of God. Did you know things are good because God doesn't do things because something is good. Something is good because that's part of God's nature. It all flows from His nature. And He says on more than one occasion, my nature is changeless, right? I am the Lord. I change not. And so that's where all ultimate good comes from. Justice, righteousness. And He's always consistent. And whatever He does, commands, or approves is what's good. And He doesn't violate His own nature. So here's the deal. This moral argument for the existence of God exposes atheism as self-contradictory because here's their two options. An atheist must either reject the truthfulness of the moral argument's first premise. What's the first premise? If objective moral value exists, then God exists. If there is objective moral value, there has to be a moral lawgiver to which people are amenable. I mean, that's just that simple. If it's objective. And so they must either reject that argument and illogically accept the idea that objective morality somehow came through rocks and reptiles and other things. Or two, they have to reject the second premise, that is, objective moral values exist. They have to say, and a few are willing to say this, just a few. A few are willing to say there are no objective moral values, but most of them are not willing to say that. Because they know they wouldn't want to live in a place like that. And here's the thing, if atheism is true, and all moral values are subjective, upon what basis could we ever punish anybody for doing something that we think, quote, is wrong, If he says, well, not wrong for me. I mean, you got your values and I got mine, and that's not part of mine. So, stealing your car is not part of my values. I mean, I understand you don't do that, but it's okay for me to do that. If there is no God, there is no objective basis to say some things are right, others are wrong. It can only, objective good and evil can only exist if they're, and here's the thing, and keep this in mind as we're getting ready to move on. When we get to, in a couple of Roman numerals from now, to the idea of suffering, it's always been considered that the greatest argument the atheist has against the objective of the God of the Bible, or against the existence of the God of the Bible, is the existence of human pain and suffering, especially upon the innocent and so forth. But they can't even make that argument consistently. If your argument is there's no such thing as if your argument is there is objective evil, therefore God doesn't exist, you've just admitted that He exists. Because you can't have objective evil if there's no God. They can't make that argument. If they're a real atheist, there is no objective good and evil, so why do you even care about the whole suffering argument? I mean, then you would just say, well, we suffer because we live in a purposeless, mean, harsh universe. That's just the way it is. That would be the more consistent position. But as soon as you admit that there is objective evil or good, you've admitted the existence of a God. Morality demands a moral lawgiver. F, the Bible's supernatural attributes demand a supernatural author. We are not going to spend a lot of time on this because, and we're going to spend a bunch of time on this when we get over to Roman numeral 13 on page 5. But we do need to mention it. I don't believe that God exists simply because the Bible says He does. Nor do I believe that the Bible is the Word of God simply because it claims to be. Anybody can make those claims. Name me some books. What are some other books that claim divine? The Quran. What else? Book of Mormon. There's some other books that claim they came from supernatural creators. So anybody can claim that. But what's important, if I look at the Bible, it must possess what? It must possess attributes that are superhuman, that say to me, it's of supernatural origin, right? Dan Barker said that one of the things that could falsify atheism would be if God spoke to man and gave him specific information about future events. Okay. Well, has He done that? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of those things we look at when we look at lines of evidence that confirm that the Bible is the Word of God. And we've got several listed back here in your outline that we're going to look at eventually. But that's the first one. Predictive prophecy. And there's several others listed there that we'll look at. And why do you think that skeptics spend so much time trying to argue about the dates of when particular books are written? There's all kinds of arguments out there. Well, Isaiah wasn't really written in 700 BC. Daniel especially wasn't written, right, in 500 or so BC. Why? Why do they have to say, well, Daniel was written by a guy like in 160 BC? Right, because of all the amazing, specific, predictive prophecies that were made hundreds of years before they happened. And so they have to say, well, no, we have to late date those, but their arguments don't hold water. But that's why time has to be spent in what's called they call it in scholarly circles. Higher criticism, is that what it's called? I think it's called, is it higher criticism? I'm losing my... Well, but there's a certain form of criticism that we call it criticism, and people think they're criticizing the Bible. It's actually a study of the text itself and when it was written. Huh? Yeah, textual criticism maybe. And sometimes people read the word criticism and think, oh, they're not criticizing the Bible. They're simply breaking it down and determining, who wrote it when and all that. Maybe it's textual criticism. But that's what those studies and defenses are all about. So the fact of the matter is the Bible exudes supernatural attributes. We'll talk about that some more, but that's just another one of those things that says, hey, if there is a God, a creator, if He spoke to us and He left us something that indicates its supernatural origin, then that's just another line of evidence. And the Bible is certainly one of those lines of evidence. Same thing on this last point. And again, the historical miracle-working resurrected Jesus demands a supernatural explanation. Well, again, we're going to look at that a little more in Roman numeral 14. But the point being, I went to a football game last night. I don't know if y'all know that. You may have watched it on TV. But athletes, doesn't matter what sport, and I've watched a lot. And I watch sports sometimes that other people don't understand or appreciate. And I do that because the things these guys do amazes me. It really does. I'm talking about at the highest levels. Some people don't appreciate soccer in this country. But on Saturday mornings, I love to watch English Premier League soccer because the things those guys can do with that ball, with their feet. We do everything with our hands. Anybody can do something with their hands. The things they can do with their feet boggles my mind because I've tried to play the sport and I've watched my daughter play. But people can do amazing things. People can run a marathon, 26 miles, and some of those guys run a marathon and they do about 5-minute miles. Whole 26 minutes. Can you imagine that? I would never in my lifetime run a 5-minute mile, just a mile. And there's guys out there that can run 26 of them without stopping. It's amazing. But we all know that there comes a certain point where there are just some things that are humanly impossible. No matter how many movies we watch, and no matter how many superhero movies we watch. We all know that's make-believe. I can't walk on water. Neither can you, unassisted. I can't give sight to the blind. I can't put a man's ear back on. I certainly can't raise the dead. It's always interesting to me, Brother Elkins used to say, when he was talking to these Pentecostals and other people that believed in miracles, he would say, well, okay, let's go out to the cemetery and you tell that guy to get up and I'll tell him to stay down and we see who wins. Right? We know people can't do that. But if there was a man that ever existed that could do that, what would that tell me about him? Yeah. He's a divine, supernatural being. He's not like me. He was like me in some ways, but not in other ways. And so, again, quoting from Dan Barker, he once said, if Jesus were to materialize and work any number of miraculous deeds, atheism would be disproven. Well, okay. Well, he's done that. And the fact of the matter is that these people, even if he did, in front of them. So let me read you what Richard Dawkins said in 2012. Somebody asked him, what proof, by the way, would change your mind about being atheistic? He said, that's a very difficult and interesting question because, I used to think that if somehow, great big giant 900-foot high Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson suddenly strode in and said, I exist, here I am. But now notice, but even that, I actually sometimes wonder if that would, You see, here's the thing. If you've determined not to believe something, it wouldn't matter. Let's go back to the days of Christ. How many miracles did He work in front of these people? Did they believe in Him, who He was? Somebody says, well, I wish I could have seen it, I'd believe. Really? He's hanging on the cross, and the elders that had seen all that stuff said, if He's the Christ, let Him come down, save Himself. He could have come down. He could have come down, and they wouldn't have believed in Him. You say, how you know that? Because they'd already seen it. Jesus was talking, or Abraham was talking to the rich man as he lifted up his eyes in torment. And what did the rich man say? Do me a favor. Send Lazarus back to my brothers so that, they don't come to this place. In other words, have him come back from the dead. And what did Abraham say to him? They have Moses and the prophets. If they won't believe Moses and the prophets, if they don't believe the Old Testament, they wouldn't believe if somebody came back from the dead. Is that true? Absolutely. If a person's determined not to believe, he's not going to. No matter if a 900-foot Jesus appeared and said, here I am. So we can't be surprised that even with all of these lines of evidence that many people are just going to say, I'm not going to believe because I don't want to. It's not convenient for me. It doesn't fit in with my lifestyle and the way I want to live. Because basically when it all gets down to it, rather than worship the God of heaven, who do we want to worship? I want to be on the throne of my own life, make my own decision, not have anybody telling me what to do, and not be responsible to anybody. What they fail to realize is it doesn't matter that you don't want to do that. You still have to answer for it. But you can't ignore it while here. 7 lines of reasoning that with regard to the existence of God. Well, that leads us into the next topic, if y'all have it up there, Roman numeral 4. From the existence of God to man. And this is important before we get into this whole concept of suffering. But the Bible's, we're made in His image, His likeness. And so the question we ask ourselves is, what does that mean? Go over to Genesis chapter 1. That's kind of the basis for this section. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created him, male and female, He created them. And so we're made in His image, obviously endowing us with certain qualities that are intrinsic to His nature. So we have to ask ourselves, first of all, before we ask what it does mean, what does that mean, created in His image and likeness? What does it not mean? What does it not mean? And number 1 there it says, not in His essence. We're not divine, by the way. Some people think they are. People in the past thought they were, right? You remember the king of Tyre? Ezekiel said, you say, I am a God and sit in the seat of gods in the midst of the seas, yet you are a man and not a God. Ezekiel 28 verse 2. There's been a lot of people in the past, Roman emperors, claim to be divine. Well, they're not. They weren't. You remember King Herod in Acts chapter 12? Remember he gave that oration, and what did the people say? The voice of a God, not of a man. And what did he do? Yeah, that sounds good to me. I think I feel God-like today. And the Bible says he was eaten of worms. History says that he, over a period of several months, his bowels rotted out. He died a horrible, painful death because of his arrogance. Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra in Acts chapter 14. What did the people try to do? Tried to worship them. But what was the proper response? Hey, we're men with the same nature as you. We're preaching that you should turn from these things. You know, and that's what basically Satan told Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, wasn't it? Isn't that what he tried to convince them? Well, God says you shouldn't eat of this tree. You know why he don't want you to eat of this tree? You'll be just like him. Be just like him. And people have been feeling that way ever since. These New Age people are kind of like that. Y'all know Shirley MacLaine. And she's an okay actress. Not much of a philosopher, though. In addressing what she refers to as her higher self in her book, Dancing in the Light, she said, I am God. Because all energy is plugged into the same source. We are each aspects of that source. We're all part of God. We are individualized reflections of the God source. God is us and we are God. I have no idea what that means, but 1989 book, Going Within, she wrote, I, for example, do a silent mantra with each of my hatha yoga poses, whatever those are. I hold each yoga position for 20 seconds and internally chant, I am God in light. Well, we're not divine. Also, in what it does not mean, number 2 there, you'll notice in your outline, we're not creating His image in physical appearance. In Acts chapter 17, Paul said, God is not like gold or silver or stone. Go back to 10 Commandments. Don't make any graven image. Why? Why? Why not make a graven image to represent God? He doesn't look like that. That's not Him. He's not physical. He's spirit, John 4:24. God is spirit. In Luke 24:39, as Thomas was looking at Jesus, Jesus said, hey, touch me. For a spirit does not have what? What did Jesus say? In Luke 24. What did He say to Thomas? A spirit does not have what? Flesh and bones. Spirit does not have flesh and bones. God is spirit. Jesus said a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. We're not made in His physical appearance. And I realize there are references to God with physical manifestations in order to help us understand them. You know, the Bible talks about the hand of God, the eyes of God, but that's an accommodation to what we understand. So, He's not physical. We're not divine. We're not created equal with Him as divine creatures. And He's not physical. So, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Well, the Bible doesn't explicitly state that, but there's a lot of things we can look at from the text. If you just go to Genesis 1 and 2, you see several points about the creation of man and other life. You see a divine conference, first of all. God said what? What was his exact wording in Genesis 1:26? Let us. So here's God in a conference. Conference with who? The rest of the members of the Godhead. You go into Acts, it says that Jesus was delivered up by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God. Well, God only counsels with Himself. So He says, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. He doesn't say that of animals. So you see that difference right off. We're not animals. He'd already created the animals. He didn't say that. It also says that man was formed rather than being commanded to appear. He then breathed what? What does it say? Breathed into him the breath of life, right? Spirit. It's also interesting, too, that when the animals were created, both sexes appeared at the same time. Not so with man. And of course, unlike animals, we're not broken down into various kinds. Or if you want to be more specific, species. How many kinds or species of humans do you know? Not any. There's all kinds of different animals. The psalmist in Psalm chapter 8 spoke of man as being created a little lower than what? Angels. Never said that of animals. But we're different. And you can't restrict that phrase, image of God, to one particular feature. Paul said in Acts 17, we've already referred to Acts 17, that we're the offspring of God. So there are a lot of things that are about us that are like God. Not just one thing, but a bunch of things. And I think we made a list there. Number one, we can speak. We can communicate. How many animals can do that? Intelligently. First of all, we have self-awareness. Did you know that I know that I'm separate from you and the universe around me? I don't know that animals are. I have self-awareness. I can think about myself. I can think about other people, but I can think about myself, my plans, my hopes, my dreams. It's different from the animal kingdom. But we can speak and we can communicate. And I know that animals can communicate in some primitive ways with each other, but not by speaking. They don't have an alphabet. They can mimic, the parrot. You can teach them a few things to mimic, but he's not really speaking. Man is creative. This is interesting, and I'm going to leave you with this, and we'll pick up here next week. Beavers construct dams, right? How many beavers do you know, when they get ready to build their dam, call the beaver real estate agent? Say, I need a new dam. I don't know whether I'm going to buy or build. She says, well, I can put you in touch with a beaver architect and a beaver contractor. It doesn't work that way. We are way different from the animal kingdom. We'll pick up there next week. Thank you.